She walked barefoot across black stone, and an entire kingdom held its breath to watch her die. The iron collar at her throat was colder than the winter outside, one word carved into it, in the old script priests used when they wanted cruelty to read like law. Nobody called it murder. They called it tribute. Dragonfire burned along both walls. Every time the flames jumped, the left hand of the man on the throne twitched. Once. Barely. Not a soul in that hall noticed. She did. Her wrists were bound in silver ribbon, wound tight enough to bite. 3 days without sleep. No boots. No name anyone would say out loud. The nobles leaned in, from the galleries above, silver cups halfway to their mouths. Then the floor began to shake. Not thunder. Not drums. Something older, coming up through the stone and into the bones of everyone standing on it. Behind the throne, the iron doors groaned and started opening from the inside. The collar was cold. That was the first thing Ilyana Voss noticed. Not the eyes on her. Not the silence pressing down from every gallery above. The collar. Iron. Old iron, forged before her grandfather's grandfather ever drew breath, and it sat against her collarbone like a hand that never let go. Cursed. That was the word carved into it. One word. Old script, the kind priests used when they wanted a curse to look like scripture, when they wanted cruelty to read like law. She had worn some version of that word her whole life. 22 years. 22 years of villagers stepping off the path when she walked it. 22 years of empty chairs at her own family's table, because nobody wanted to sit close enough to catch whatever she was carrying. 22 years of learning that a rumor repeated enough times stops needing evidence. It just needs momentum. Now the whole kingdom of Emberfall had gathered to watch her die in a wedding dress. They did not call it murder. They never did. Murder was a word for back alleys, for men with knives, and no titles. This was tribute. Tribute had paperwork. Tribute had a priest and a chalice, and men in fine collars, who called it lawful right up until the last breath left her body. That was the trick of it. Give a killing enough ceremony, and men will call it civilized. Give it a chalice, and a treaty, and a room full of silk, and somehow the word murder never has to enter anyone's mouth at all. The hall was called the Hall of Wings, and it earned the name. Dragon bone arches curved overhead like the ribs of something ancient and dead, and dragonfire braziers burned along both walls, casting orange light across black marble polished, so fine it looked wet. Nobles stood beneath those arches in silk and fur, holding silver cups, pretending they had come for wine and gossip. They had not. They had come to see if a cursed girl's touch could kill a king. Ilyana walked the aisle barefoot. They had taken her boots at the border. Said tribute brides walk as they were born. Humble. Stripped. Owned. The tribute silk they'd wrapped her in was thin as breath, and the winter cold coming off the black stone cut straight through it, straight into her legs, and she made herself walk anyway. 1 foot. Then the other. Because if she stopped, they would say the curse had frozen her. Because if she fell, they would say it was guilt. Because every version of failing in this room would become proof, and she had learned a long time ago that proof was the one thing people like her were never given the luxury of controlling. So she didn't fail. Her wrists were bound in ceremonial silver ribbon, wound tight enough to bite. Her dark hair hung loose and unwashed, 3 days without sleep pulling the color out of her face, until she looked like something already halfway to the other side. Which, she supposed, was the point. A bride who looked half dead already made the ceremony feel like less of a shock when it finished the job. At the far end of the hall, on a throne built from black iron and the fossilized wings of a dragon nobody living had ever seen alive, sat the king. Kaelin Ashran. She had expected an old man. That was what the songs said. Dragon kings die slow and mean, poisoned by their own fire, wasting away on thrones too big for them, crowns too heavy for skulls gone brittle with age. But the man on that throne was young. Broad through the shoulders. Black hair, stormwater black, and a face carved from something harder than patience. He wore black armor beneath a cloak lined in raven fur, and above his brow sat a crown that was not gold. Dragon bone. Dipped in ash metal until it looked like something torn from a corpse and worn as a warning to everyone still breathing. Every soul in that hall feared him. Except Ilyana didn't look at his crown. She looked at his hand. His left hand. Resting on the arm of the throne. Still. Too still. The kind of stillness that takes effort, the kind a man builds on purpose, because letting the hand move would tell the whole room something he'd rather they never learned. Because every time the braziers flared, every single time the fire jumped along the wall, that hand twitched. Just slightly. Just enough. And the court read it as menace. The court read everything about this man as menace, because menace was easier to understand than the alternative, and courts are full of people who would rather be afraid of a monster than curious about a wound. Ilyana read it as pain. She knew pain. She had grown up inside it, wore it the way other girls wore ribbons, learned its grammar the way scholars learn dead languages. She knew the difference between a man enjoying his cruelty and a man enduring something he couldn't name out loud, something he'd spent years teaching his own face to hide. Kaelin Ashran was enduring. Nobody else in that hall seemed to notice. Nobody else had spent 22 years learning to read the small, private failures men tried to hide, because nobody else had needed that skill to survive. Beside the throne stood another man. Older. Silver threading through dark hair, robes cut from black and silver silk, and a smile that sat on his mouth like something borrowed, something he'd put on that morning along with the robes and hadn't taken off since. Lord Voran Ashran. The king's uncle. The architect of tonight. He was the one who had ridden to Greywatch, with a treaty already written, ink already dry, before her father had even seen the page. The one who had sat across from him and explained, in the calm voice men use, when they've already decided something, and only need the other person to catch up, that House Voss's border debt could vanish. That the girl everyone called cursed might finally be useful for something. That sending her north wasn't cruelty. It was mercy, dressed as arithmetic, and arithmetic, Voran had always understood, was a language that frightened men found very easy to trust. Bring her forward, Voran said. The guards pushed. Ilyana stumbled. Somewhere above, laughter moved through the gallery, quiet and sharp, the kind of laughter that costs nothing and takes everything, the kind that only exists in rooms where nobody is afraid of consequences. She lifted her chin before her knees could finish buckling. That was the one thing Greywatch had never managed to beat out of her. The refusal to go down on command. If they wanted her broken, they would have to do the work themselves. She would not hand it to them for free, not tonight, not with an entire kingdom watching, and if this was going to be the last thing they remembered about her, she intended it to be that. Kaelin watched that. She felt it before she understood it, the shift in his gaze. It didn't slide off her the way the court's stares did, curious and cruel, and gone in a blink, already moving on to the next spectacle. His stopped. Sharpened. Measured her like a man studying a locked door, trying to decide whether to open it or burn it down, and not entirely sure, even to himself, which answer he was hoping for. The high priest of Ash lifted a black chalice, and his voice rolled out over the hall, flat and rehearsed, the cadence of a man who had said these words so many times the meaning had worn smooth beneath them. By treaty of blood and flame. House Voss offers Ilyana Voss as tribute bride to the dragon throne of Emberfall. If her curse proves false, the border debt is forgiven. If her curse proves true, a pause, timed for effect, House Voss is absolved of consequence. For the bride was received. By royal choice. Royal choice. Ilyana almost laughed. Almost. Her father had signed that treaty with a hand that shook so badly the ink smeared across half the page. Her brothers had watched from the doorway while servants packed her into white silk, and not one of them had looked her in the eye while they did it, because looking would have made it real in a way none of them wanted to carry. Her aunt had whispered, the night before the carriage came, that perhaps at last her cursed life could buy something useful. Useful. That was what 22 years came down to. A dangerous object. Wrapped in bridal cloth. Shipped north like grain, like ore, like anything else a house needed to trade away to balance a ledger. The priest turned to the throne. Your Majesty. Do you accept the tribute? The hall held its breath. All of it. Every silver cup stopped halfway to every mouth, every conversation folded into silence, the whole room bending toward the single word that would decide whether tonight ended in ceremony or execution, as if there were still a meaningful difference between the two. Kaelin rose. The movement alone silenced whatever whispers had survived, and he came down the steps slowly, black cloak dragging behind him across the stone, and with every footfall the braziers along the wall burned higher. Hotter. Ilyana felt the heat reach her skin before he did. And beneath it, something else. Something no priest had warned her about, something no song about dragon kings had ever mentioned. A pull. Deep in her ribs. Faint. Undeniable. Like a wound recognizing another wound across a crowded room, two hurts finding each other by scent alone. He stopped in front of her. Close enough now that she could see it, a thin, dark vein beneath the skin of his throat, pulsing like trapped flame. Not a jewel. Not paint. She had grown up around wounds men tried to hide behind pride, and she knew one, when she saw it, the way you know a scar even under a sleeve. They say your touch kills, Kaelin said. Low. Even. Not a question, so much as a test, the kind a man gives, when he already suspects the answer, and wants to see how the other person carries it. Ilyana looked up at him. They say many things, she said, when I'm not allowed to answer. A hush went through the hall like cold water. Voron's smile thinned by a fraction of an inch. Kaelin's expression didn't soften. But something moved behind his eyes, small and quick, gone almost before it arrived. You're allowed to answer now, he said. No. Her voice didn't shake. She made sure of that, forced the steadiness into it the way she'd forced her spine straight for 22 years. I'm allowed to speak, because everyone here expects my words to be the last sound I make. Someone gasped, up in the gallery. The priest stiffened. Bride. Remember where you stand. I remember exactly where I stand, Ilyana said. In a hall full of people hoping my death will prove them right. For one heartbeat, Kaelin Ashran almost smiled. Then the wall behind the throne shook. Not thunder. Not drums. Something older, something that came up, through the stone floor, and into the bones of every person standing on it, a vibration that felt less like sound, and more like memory. A dragon's breath. The court went pale in one motion, like a held note breaking. Voron stepped forward fast. The beast should remain below. Kaelin turned his head. He woke? Before anyone could answer, the iron doors behind the throne groaned open from the inside, and something enormous dragged itself through the gap. Ilyana forgot how to breathe. The dragon was massive. Ancient. Ruined. Scales black as cooled glass, but cracked everywhere, and beneath the cracks ran thin lines of dull red fire, as if something inside him had been burning too long, and too quietly for anyone to notice, until it finally started leaking out through the seams. One wing hung wrong, dragging against the stone. His eyes, which must have once burned gold, were dim now. Fevered. The eyes of something that had stopped expecting anything good from the world, and had simply been waiting, for a very long time, for for permission to stop. Guards scattered. Priests lifted charms with shaking hands. Nobles fled behind pillars, silk trailing, cups abandoned on the floor, the whole careful architecture of the evening's power collapsing into the oldest instinct any of them had. Kaelin went still. The dragon looked past all of it. Past the throne. Past the king. Straight at Ilyana. Her heart struck once, hard, like a fist against a door that had been locked so long she'd forgotten it could open. The pull in her ribs turned to pain. The dragon took one staggering step toward her. Then another. Kaelin moved as if to block him, but the beast made a sound, not a threat, not a command, but something older and heavier. Grief. Grief so deep it seemed to darken the whole hall around it, like a shadow, with no source, like sorrow that had been accumulating in the dark for so long it had learned to move on its own. Ilyana's bound hands began to glow. White gold light bled through the silver ribbon at her wrists. Vorin whispered, "Impossible." The dragon lowered his massive head until it hovered before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath against her face, and then a voice filled the hall. Not spoken. Not through any mouth. A voice that lived in bone. In blood. In the white fire suddenly roaring through every brazier along the wall, as though the whole building had been waiting its entire existence to say this one word. Queen. Nobody breathed. The word had not been loud. It hadn't needed to be. It had gone into every person in that hall like fire poured straight into marrow, and for a long, ringing moment, the Hall of Wings held nothing but silence and white light. Ilyana did not feel like a queen. She felt cold. Hungry. Exhausted past the point where fear made sense anymore. She felt like a girl sold in silk by a family relieved to be rid of her, standing in the wreckage of a ceremony that had suddenly gone somewhere none of the men who wrote it had ever intended. But the dragon looked at her, not with suspicion, not with fear, with recognition so raw it nearly split her open. Kaelin stepped between her and the court. It was a small movement. A single step. But it changed the shape of the entire hall, because his body now blocked half the spears already rising toward her, and his jaw was carved tight, and Ilyana saw the confusion he could not fully hide, the confusion of a man watching his own certainty crack in front of witnesses. The dragon had spoken to her. Not to him. Not to the bloodline that supposedly ruled every flame in Emberfall, that had built its entire legitimacy on being the one voice a dragon would ever answer. To her. Vorin recovered first. He always would. Men like him didn't feel shock the way other men did. They processed it and moved straight to advantage, treating even catastrophe as a problem with a solution somewhere inside it. This is witchcraft, he said. The word landed on the court like permission. Yes, a noble whispered from the gallery. A death curse. She's turned the beast. Kill her before the bond completes. Kaelin's hand closed around the hilt of his sword. No one moves. Vorin turned on him sharply. Your Majesty. The dragon named her queen before witnesses. If the court believes a cursed tribute can command royal flame, your throne is finished before the week is out. Kaelin didn't look away from the dragon. Then the court will learn to believe carefully. The dragon exhaled, and the force of it swept across Ilyana's bare feet, not burning, searching, moving up through her body like heat looking for a door it already knew existed. The glow beneath her wrists pulsed once, hard, and a memory tore through her mind, so fast she staggered. A woman walking through a field of dead dragons. Hands white gold. A black egg cracked open under a moonless sky. A child crying inside a ring of burned roses. Gone. As fast as it came. Ilyana gasped. Kaelin heard it. His eyes snapped to hers. What did you see? The question frightened her worse than the court did. I don't know. Answer me. I said I don't know. The glow faded just slightly, as if the truth itself had settled the air between them. Kalen studied her, suspicion sharp across his face, and beneath it, something else. Something unwilling. Fascination, wearing armor, the way a man's curiosity sometimes wears the same shape as his caution, because he hasn't yet decided which one is going to win. The high priest lifted his ash-black staff. The tribute must be tested. If her curse has reached the royal dragon, the old laws demand purification. Ilyana knew what purification meant. Every cursed child in Greywatch knew. A clean word. For fire. A sacred word for killing whatever frightened men in robes, dressed up in enough ceremony, that nobody had to call it what it actually was. Her stomach dropped through the floor. The dragon growled, and the whole hall shook with it. Kalen placed one hand against the beast's jaw. The gesture should have looked commanding. Instead it looked like it hurt him. The vein at his throat pulsed dark, and for one heartbeat his knees seemed to give, just slightly, just enough for Ilyana to see it. And for Voron to see it too. That was the moment Ilyana understood the second danger in the room. Kalen Ashran wasn't only hiding a dying dragon. He was hiding that the dragon's sickness lived inside him. 2. That the two of them were bound together in some way the court had never been allowed to suspect, let alone see. Voron's voice went smooth as a drawn blade. Your Majesty. For the good of Emberfall. Remove the bride from the hall. And do what with her? Contain her. The word made Ilyana's mouth go dry. Containment. That was what powerful men called cages, when they wanted the word to sound civilized, when they wanted the cruelty of it to slide past a room, without anyone quite noticing what had just been decided. Kalen looked at her again. You came as tribute. I was sent as tribute, she said. There's a difference. A stir moved through the court. His eyes narrowed. To the person being sold, she said. Yes. Something flickered across his face. Not softness. Not yet. But the hit landed somewhere under the armor, and she saw it land, saw the small crack it left behind. Voron's voice hardened. She speaks boldly for a cursed bride. Ilyana turned to him. I've been called cursed my whole life, my lord. The word loses its strength when men use it every time they need a woman to carry the cost of their fear. The court hissed. Actually hissed, a room full of silk and gold making a sound like a nest of snakes disturbed by light. Kalen went very still. For one terrible second, Ilyana thought she had gone too far. Maybe she had. But if this hall intended to burn her, before the night was through, she would not spend her last words sounding grateful for the privilege of being allowed to speak them. Enough, Kalen said. The tribute ceremony is suspended. The priest went white. Your Majesty. Suspended. Nobody argued the second word. Kalen turned to the guards. Take her to the Ember Aviary. Voron's eyes flashed. The royal aviary? The dragon called her queen. Kalen's voice was flat iron. I will know why. Before anyone names her witch. Relief did not come. The Ember Aviary was not safety. It was a deeper chamber inside the same beast that had already tried, in its own strange way, to unmake her once tonight, just with better manners than the court had shown. Still. It was not the purification fire. Not yet. The guards approached. The dragon growled, until Kalen murmured something low, in a language Ilyana didn't recognize, old and rough at the edges, and the beast lowered his head. Reluctantly. His gaze stayed fixed on her the entire time the guards led her toward the side passage, as though letting her out of his sight even for a moment might undo whatever had just happened between them. As she passed him, Kalen caught her bound wrist. It should have meant nothing. A brief touch. Half a second, no longer than a heartbeat. Instead, the moment his fingers closed over the silver ribbon, pain flashed across his face, and the glow beneath her skin surged straight into his hand. His breath caught. Her vision blurred, and for one dizzying moment she was somewhere else. She saw him, as a boy, kneeling beside a wounded black dragon hatchling, his palms burned raw, from trying to keep it alive, through a night that should have killed them both. She saw a crown placed on his head, before he was ready for the weight of it, before his shoulders had grown into the shape a crown demands. She saw a woman, with silver eyes pressing something into his chest, whispering words that curled like smoke, and settled somewhere he'd never be able to fully scrub clean. "Your true queen will destroy you." Ilyana stumbled back. Kaelin released her hand like it had burned him, which, in a way, it had. The court hadn't seen the vision. But Vorin had seen the touch. He'd seen the king's face, when it happened, seen the half-second, where something in Kaelin's careful architecture had genuinely shifted. And his smile disappeared. In the corridor beyond the Hall of Wings, Ilyana heard the nobles erupt behind her. Witch. Queen. Curse. Tribute. Her name became a dozen different weapons in a dozen different mouths, all at once, all fighting to be the loudest, all certain they had finally understood something the others hadn't. The guards took her down a spiral stair, deeper, and the heat rose to meet her, thick with smoke and something else. Something sick. Her wrists still glowed faintly beneath the ribbon, but now another mark had begun to burn under her skin, hidden just below her collarbone, quiet at first, then insistent, like something remembering how to wake up. A dragon scale. White gold. Alive. Somewhere behind her, in the throne hall she'd just left, the dying dragon roared her name, into the dark, and the sound followed her the whole way down, as though he couldn't bear to let it fade even once she was out of sight. The Ember Aviary was not a cage. It was a cathedral built for something too old to kneel. The chamber opened beneath the palace in a vast circle of black volcanic stone, its ceiling lost somewhere up in drifting smoke, its walls veined with sleeping fire that pulsed faintly like something breathing in its sleep, something that had learned, over centuries, to breathe as quietly as possible so nobody would come looking for the reason why. Iron balconies ringed the upper levels, and on them stood royal healers, dragon wardens, armed guards, all watching from what they clearly hoped was a safe distance. At the center of it all lay the dragon. His enormous body curled around a pool of dull red embers, one torn wing folded wrong against his side. His scales, which should have shone glossy as obsidian, were cracked and fading, red gold light leaking through the fractures like a furnace dying behind broken glass, like something that had been asked to burn for far longer than any single creature should have been asked to. Ilyana forgot the guards behind her. Forgot Kaelin's court, Vorin's smile, the word queen still burning through her bones. The dragon was in pain. Not the clean pain of a wound. This was old pain. Pain repeated so many times it had stopped being an event and become part of him instead, folded into the architecture of his body the way grief folds into a face, over decades, the way a scar stops being a story and just becomes skin. His breath scraped across the chamber floor, and every exhale shook loose a thin fall of ash from the walls, as if the room itself had absorbed some measure of his suffering and was slowly, patiently, giving it back. When Ilyana was pushed through the gate, his golden eye opened. The whole aviary changed. The dragon lifted his head. The guards behind her raised their spears. Ilyana stepped forward before fear could catch up to her. "Don't." A guard grabbed her arm. "You don't command us," she said. "No," she said, staring at the dragon's trembling jaw. "But if you point silver at him again, he will burn you, before he remembers he's dying." The guard's grip loosened. The dragon rumbled, not approval, exactly. Closer to recognition, the low, wary sound of something deciding, cautiously, that this particular human hadn't come to hurt him. Then Kaelin entered. Alone. No crown. No uncle. Just the black armor, which somehow made him look less like a man, and more like judgment given a shape and told to walk. The guards bowed. Ilyana didn't. She was too tired, too frightened, too far past the point of remembering court manners that had never once been extended to her in return. Kaelin noticed. His gaze moved from her face down to her bound wrists, where the ribbon still glowed faint gold. "Leave us," he said. The nearest warden stiffened. "Your Majesty. She may be dangerous." "Yes," Kaelin said. "So am I." Nobody argued. When the gate shut behind them, the sound rolled through the aviary like a verdict. Ilyana stood between the Dragon King and the dying beast, suddenly, sharply aware of how alone she was. No court to witness. No priest to interrupt. No uncle smiling while he tightened the noose one polite word at a time. Only a king whose touch had shown her a curse. And a dragon who had called her queen before a single human being had ever called her innocent. Kaelin stepped closer. "What did you see?" "When I touched you." Her pulse tightened in her throat. "You were a boy." His face hardened. "You were with him." She looked at the dragon. "He was small then." "Hurt." "You burned your hands keeping him alive." Kaelin said nothing. "And a woman cursed you." Her voice dropped. "She said your true queen would destroy you." The vein at his throat flared dark. The dragon made a low, broken sound, like something remembering a wound it had hoped had finally scarred over. Kaelin's hand closed slowly into a fist. "Who are you?" There it was again. Not who. What? Wearing different clothes, the same question every powerful man in her life had eventually gotten around to asking, once they realized she wasn't going to fit the shape they'd already built for her. Ilyana lifted her chin. "I'm the woman your court bought to die in white silk." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." He moved closer, and the heat of him reached her, before his body did, dragonfire under his skin, unstable, wounded, a fire that had learned to hide itself out of necessity, because showing it had never once been safe. She could feel it now. Feel enough to understand that touching flame hurt him, and ruling through it hurt him more, every single day, in ways nobody in that court had ever bothered to ask about. "You carry a mark," he said. Her hand moved to her collarbone, before she meant it to. His eyes followed. "Show me." "No." The refusal came out fast. Sharp. Instinctive, like a hand pulled back from a stove, before the mind even registered the heat. Kaelin went very still. Kings were not told no. Not in their own aviaries. Not by tribute brides 3 days from execution, 3 days from being nothing more than an entry in a ledger somebody else had written. She expected anger. Instead she saw restraint pull tight across his face, like a chain drawn hard against itself, a man forcing his own instinct to heal. "Why?" he asked. "Because every man who's ever asked to see my curse was looking for proof I deserved what came next." The words sat between them, heavier than either of them had expected. Something shifted in his eyes. He didn't apologize. A man like Kaelin Ashran probably didn't know how to apologize, without it sounding like another command, but he stepped back. Half a pace. Small. It mattered more than it should have. The dragon lowered his head toward Ilyana, slow enough not to startle her. His breath stirred the white silk against her skin. She looked into his golden eye, and this time, instead of the flashing fragments that had struck her in the throne room, something deeper opened, a longer, quieter unspooling, as though the dragon had decided she was ready to see more than a glimpse. She saw generations. Not seconds. Years folded into years, the way a mountain folds centuries into stone. She saw a line of women, one after another, each carrying the same faint mark beneath the collarbone, each one loved by a dragon, and feared by a crown in equal measure. She saw the first of them standing beside a dragon made of dawn light, unafraid, her hand raised not in command, but in offering a bond that asked nothing and demanded nothing, because both sides had simply chosen it. She saw that same woman grow old beside her dragon, gray-haired, laughing, neither one of them ever once needing a chain. Then she saw the version of history that came after. Kings who inherited the throne, but not the trust. Kings who looked at a bond that pure and felt, for the first time, afraid of something they couldn't fully control. She saw the first chain forged, small at first, disguised as ceremony, as ritual, as tradition, the way most cruelty begins small enough that nobody in the room feels responsible for where it ends. She saw women of her bloodline vanish from court records, one generation at a time, their names scraped off banners the way names get scraped off gravestones nobody visits anymore. And she saw her own mother. Young. Frightened. Not cursed, never cursed, running through a night lit orange by fire, that wasn't her doing, an infant pressed against her chest, whispering the same 4 words, over and over like a prayer she didn't fully believe yet. If they call her cursed, she may live. Ilyana swayed. Kaelin caught her elbow, and for a moment the vision blurred between them both, his memory and hers tangled together at the edges, impossible to fully separate. A man's voice, cold, distant, ordering every bride of the white flame bloodline found. And burned. No, Ilyana said, tearing herself free, breath shaking so hard it hurt her chest. Kaelin's voice softened. Just a fraction. What did you see? My mother lied. Her voice cracked on the word lied, because it wasn't quite the right word, and she knew it even as she said it. She didn't lie. She survived. And called it a lie, so I'd never go looking for the truth underneath it. The dragon rumbled low, and Ilyana pressed a hand to her collarbone. The hidden mark burned beneath her fingers, brighter now, impossible to ignore, impossible to explain away, as anything but exactly what it was. The curse was never put on me, because I kill what I touch, she said. Kaelin watched her with dangerous focus. Then why? A voice answered from the upper balcony. Smooth. Amused. Already ahead of them. Because her blood heals what your throne destroyed. Ilyana turned. Vorin stood above them, one hand resting on the stone rail, his silver-black robes untouched by ash, as if the whole night had happened to someone else, and he'd simply come to watch the last act. Beside him stood 3 royal wardens. And a priest, holding a chain made of pale metal, that seemed to drink the light straight out of the air around it. Kaelin's face went lethal. I ordered everyone out. Vorin smiled. And I ordered the truth preserved. The dragon tried to rise. The chain snapped outward, struck the floor in front of his claws, and erupted into a circle of cold white fire. The beast roared, but the sound broke halfway through, twisted into something closer to pain. Kaelin staggered, one hand flying to his throat, where the vein pulsed black beneath his skin. Ilyana understood then. The dragon's sickness wasn't only sickness. It was a leash. Vorin looked down at her, with something almost like pity, the kind powerful men reserve for people they're about to destroy, the kind that pretends to be tenderness, while it's already counting the cost. The girl was supposed to die at first touch, he said. A clean tragedy. A cursed bride proving her curse. Instead, the beast named her. Kaelin drew his sword. You poisoned him. I preserved the kingdom. From a dying bloodline. You are my bloodline. Vorin's smile thinned. No. I am what remains. After you let sentiment rot the crown. The wardens moved in behind Ilyana. Kaelin stepped toward her, but the chain circle flared, and pain dropped him to one knee. The dragon roared again, caught somewhere between rising and collapsing, unable to do either fully. Vorin lifted his hand. Bring the bride. The wardens seized her. She struggled, uselessly, her wrists still bound, but one of them pressed cold metal against the mark beneath her collarbone, and white gold fire tore out, through her skin, so fast the whole aviary went silent. The dragon lowered his massive head. Even inside the chain circle. Not in weakness this time. In worship. Voron's face went pale. Kaelin stared at the glowing scale-shaped mark over her heart, and through the chamber the dragon's voice came again, deeper now, clearer, impossible to deny, impossible to explain away, as sickness or madness, or witchcraft dressed up in kinder words. Last queen of the white flame. The words did not echo. They settled. Down through the stone, down through the smoke, down into every person standing in that chamber, and for a long moment nobody in the Ember Aviary moved at all, as though the whole room had been holding a single collective breath, since the moment the doors first opened in the throne hall above. Ilyana could not breathe. The mark over her heart burned, through the thin silk, not as a wound, but as a memory finally waking up under her skin, tracing pale gold lines across her collarbone, and down her bound wrists. The wardens holding her stumbled back like her body had become something too sacred to touch, and above them, for one raw, unguarded second, Voron's face lost every trace of its polished certainty. That terrified her more than his cruelty ever had. Because he knew what she was. Kaelin stood beyond the ring of pale fire, sword still in hand, his black armor glowing faint red, from the dragon's weakened embers. Pain kept moving, through him every time the chain tightened around the beast. But his eyes never left her. Suspicion hadn't vanished. Neither had fear. But something else had joined them now. Something far more dangerous, for a king standing in front of his own court's judgment. Belief. Voron recovered fast, he always would, and straightened his spine like a man putting his armor back on one piece at a time. Do not listen to the beast, he said. Sickness makes dragons dream. The dragon's golden eye narrowed. Kaelin's voice came low. You knew her bloodline. I know many dead bloodlines, Voron said, and the smile came back, thinner now, strained at the edges. That is how kingdoms survive, Your Majesty. By remembering which ones must remain dead. Ilyana looked down at the mark blazing against her chest, and something in her chest went very quiet. Her whole life, they'd called her cursed, because people around her fell ill. Because gardens withered near her window. Because dogs whined and shied when she walked past. Because every living thing seemed to react to her presence like something had been disturbed, like she carried a weather system nobody else could see coming. But what if none of it had ever been death? What if wounded things had simply been reaching for her, without knowing how to ask? What if her curse had never been killing what she touched? What if it had only ever been pulling hidden rot to the surface, showing people exactly what was already wrong with them, and they'd hated her for the mirror instead of the disease? The dragon moved his head toward her, slow, desperate, and the pale chain flared again. Kaelin staggered, one hand at his throat, where the vein pulsed violently now, black threading through gold. Ilyana felt the pain, through the mark, and this time she understood its shape. Dragon and king were bound together. But the bond had been infected. Turned into a weapon by command magic laid, so long ago, and so carefully that it had come to look like tradition instead of a wound. She stepped forward. Voron's eyes sharpened. Hold her. The wardens hesitated. Hold her, he snapped. Two of them grabbed her arms. White gold light flared under their hands, and both men cried out, not burned, shaken, like something inside each of them had been forced into the light against its will. One dropped to his knees, whispering, I didn't want to bind the beast. The other staggered back, pale as bone. My lord ordered it. We all knew. Voron's expression went cold. Weak men mistake confession for virtue. Kaelin had heard enough. He drove his sword straight into the pale chain circle. The aviary exploded in white sparks. Pain slammed through him and the dragon at once, and the dragon roared, while Kaelin dropped to one knee, but he kept both hands locked around the sword and forced the blade deeper into the fire. Ilyana, he said, through his teeth. If your blood heals what my throne destroyed. Prove it. The command should have made her angry. It did. But underneath the anger was something else. A plea he clearly didn't know how to speak any other way, a man who had spent his whole life learning that asking for help looked identical to a king, to admitting weakness. She looked at the dragon, at the suffering in that ancient body, at a creature who had called her queen, before a single human being in this palace had called her innocent. Then she looked at Kaelin. A king who still didn't trust her. Who had just put his own body against a weapon meant to hold a monster, to give her one single chance. "I am not your weapon," she said. His eyes lifted to hers. "No," he said. That single word changed something in the air between them. Ilyana crossed into the chain circle. The pale fire rose around her ankles, but the mark over her heart answered it, and the flames bent away from her skin like something afraid of what it had touched. Vorin shouted for the priests to stop her. The ash priest froze instead, staring at her like a man staring at a ghost climbing straight out of a forbidden page of scripture. Ilyana reached the dragon's head. He lowered it until his brow touched the stone floor before her, and up close she saw the full weight of what had been done to him. Old scars beneath the scales. Burns that had never healed properly. Runes cut near the base of his horns, and hidden under a smear of black ash, the way a man hides a scar under a collar, because looking at it directly would mean admitting it happened. He wasn't dying, because age had finally caught him. He was dying, because generations of men had used the bond between king and dragon like a chain around a throat. And called it a crown. She placed both hands against his brow. The aviary disappeared. She saw the first white flame queen standing beside a dragon made of dawn light, swearing before witnesses that dragons would never be ruled as beasts. She saw kings, after her, growing afraid of a bond they couldn't fully command. She saw Vorin, younger, kneeling in a hidden chamber, before a woman, with silver eyes, accepting a curse meant to sever Kaelin from his dragon the moment he ever found his true queen. And she saw her own mother again, not cursed, never cursed, fleeing into the night, with an infant whose blood could undo all of it. Ilyana opened her eyes. Vorin hadn't brought her to Emberfall, because he believed she would kill Kaelin. He had brought her, because he was afraid she might save him. White fire burst, from her palms, into the dragon's skull. The chain circle screamed, an actual, physical scream, metal tearing against its own nature, and Kaelin gasped, as the poison buried in the bond rose to the surface, black veins spreading fast beneath his throat and jaw. Ilyana felt all of it. The dragon's pain. The king's curse. The old command magic wrapped, so tightly around both of them, that neither had ever known where the leash ended and their own will began. She could burn it out. But not alone. She looked at Kaelin. "If I break this, it will hurt you." His mouth curved, faint, despite the agony written across his whole body. "Most things worth surviving do." "No," she said. "Listen to me. You have to choose it. Your dragon can't be free if you still believe he belongs to you." The aviary went silent except for the hiss of the chains. Kaelin looked at the dragon. And for the first time all night, his face broke open, not in weakness. In grief. "He was all I had." The dragon's golden eye softened. "That isn't ownership," Ilyana whispered. "Unless you make it one." Kaelin lowered his sword. Vorin's voice cracked across the chamber. "If you release the royal bond, the throne will no longer answer you alone." Kaelin turned his head, just slightly. "Then perhaps it should stop answering cowards." He placed his bloodied hand over hers, against the dragon's brow. "I choose the bond freely," he said. "And I release what was made by fear." The white flame became unbearable, a light that had no edges left, and the chain shattered into pieces that dissolved to pale ash before they ever hit the ground. The dragon rose. Not healed. Not yet. But unbound. His wings spread through the ember aviary, scattering ash and broken silver across the stone, and Vorin stumbled back against the balcony rail, horror twisting through the careful architecture of his face for the first time all night. The dragon lowered his head to Kaelin first. Then to Ilyana. And every warden in that chamber saw it happen. The Dragon King hadn't lost his beast tonight. He had gained a queen the throne had spent generations trying to bury. Ilyana stood in the wreckage of white fire and broken chain, barefoot, bleeding light from a mark she hadn't known she carried until 3 hours ago, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost cruel in how simple it was, that the girl who had walked into this palace to die had already stopped existing somewhere between the throne room and this chamber. Something else stood in her place now. She didn't know its name yet. But upstairs, in the corridors above, she could already hear the court beginning to scream it at each other. Witch. Queen. Curse. Truth. And somewhere behind her, low and rolling, and impossible to mistake for anything but what it was, the dragon exhaled a sound that might, in another life, have been called relief. Vorin was already gone from the balcony. Which meant Ilyana understood that whatever came next in this palace, it would not come from the front. It would come from underneath. Underneath. That was the word sitting in Ilyana's chest, as the ember aviary settled around her, ash still drifting down like slow snow, the freed dragon breathing hard beside her, wings half spread, testing a freedom he didn't trust yet, the way a man freed from a lifetime of prison tests a doorway before he'll walk through it. Because Vorin didn't run. Men like Vorin never ran. They retreated. Which was different. Retreating meant he already had the next move loaded, before this one finished playing out, and Ilyana understood that the moment his robes disappeared from the balcony rail, without a single backward glance. He wasn't afraid. He was rescheduling. Kaelin sat on the stone floor of the aviary, chest rising and falling too fast, the black veins along his throat fading slow, retreating back beneath his skin like something ashamed of being seen. Ilyana knelt beside him. Didn't touch him. Not yet. Her hands were still glowing faint gold, and she didn't trust what they'd do if she pressed them against a man already raw from one miracle tonight. You're bleeding, she said. I know. You should sit still. I am sitting. You're dying slower. That's not the same as sitting still. A sound came out of him. Rough. Half a laugh, cracked in the middle, like something that hadn't been used in years, and had forgotten its own shape entirely. You argue with kings, he said. I argue with everyone. Kings just take it worse. The dragon rumbled above them both, low, almost fond, and somewhere in that sound Ilyana heard something she hadn't expected to hear, from a creature that had just been screaming inside a cage of white fire. Amusement. Which? Fine. Great. Even the dragon thought this was funny, apparently, and she supposed that was fair, because nothing about tonight had gone the way any of them planned, and somehow that included the part where a cursed bride was currently bantering with a bleeding king on the floor of a collapsing throne room, while his uncle vanished into the walls of his own palace to plot something worse. Kaelin's hand found her wrist. Not the ceremonial ribbon. That was gone, burned away in the fire. Just her wrist. Skin against skin, and neither of them flinched this time, and that, Ilyana thought, was somehow the most frightening thing that had happened all night, more frightening than the dragon, more frightening than the chain. He'll come back, Kaelin said. Vorin. He always comes back. I know. You don't know him. I know men like him, Ilyana said. I grew up surrounded by them. Different faces. Same hands. Kaelin looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted, cracked open just slightly, the way stone cracks before it finally gives. He raised me, he said. After my father died. He put the crown on my head himself. His hands. I was 10. 10, Ilyana repeated, and something in her chest twisted. 10, Kaelin said again, quieter. And every year since, I told myself the chain around Thren was for his own protection. That the pain was medicine. That obedience was love wearing a strict face. Thren. The name landed in the aviary like a stone dropped in still water, and the dragon's head turned, slow, toward the sound of it, as though hearing his own name aloud had physically pulled something taut inside him. His name, Kaelin said, is Thren. Ilyana looked at the dragon. Really looked. Not at the wounds, not at the cracked scales, not at the ancient weight of him. At him. Thren, she said, and the dragon made a sound low in his chest, that she felt more than heard, something that traveled up, through the stone floor, and into her bones. Recognition. Because a name is different from a title. A name says I see you, as something more than what you're useful for, and Thren had clearly not heard his own name spoken aloud in longer than either of them wanted to think about. They didn't have long to sit in it. Because the corridor beyond the aviary gate was already full of noise. Shouting. Running feet. The particular chaos of a palace realizing, all at once, that the story it had been telling itself about its own king had just cracked straight down the middle, and there was no version of tonight anyone could put back together the way it had been an hour ago. Guards spilled through the gate first, weapons drawn, and stopped dead at the sight of Kaelin on the floor, the dragon standing free, and enormous behind him, and Ilyana with light still bleeding faintly, from beneath her skin. Nobody moved. Until Kaelin stood. Slow. Steady, even though Ilyana could see what it cost him. Report, he said. The captain of the guard swallowed hard. Lord Vorin has sealed the east wing. Says it's for the court's protection. Says the tribute bride, he stopped himself, glanced at Ilyana, corrected, says you are a threat that must be contained until the council convenes. Convenes where? The lower hall. He's already summoning the border envoys. Kaelin's jaw tightened. How fast can a man move, when he's had 15 years to plan the route? Nobody answered that. It wasn't really a question. Ilyana stepped forward. He'll build a story, before anyone else gets the chance to build the truth. Yes. Then we get there first. Kaelin looked at her. Something crossed his face, that might have been doubt, might have been respect, might have been both wearing the same expression, because sometimes those two things looked identical on a man who'd spent his whole life being told doubt and respect were opposites, one weakness and the other virtue, when in truth they'd always been closer cousins than anyone in this palace had ever admitted. You're bleeding light out of your collarbone, he said. And you want to walk into a room full of nobles, who watched a dragon call you queen 20 minutes ago. Would you rather I hide? No. Then stop wasting time being surprised I don't want to. Thren made a sound that was, unmistakably, a laugh. Or the dragon equivalent of one. Rough and low, and entirely too pleased with himself. Kaelin shot the dragon a look. You're enjoying this. The dragon didn't deny it. The lower hall was smaller than the throne room, all dark wood, and low light, built for arguments rather than ceremony, and it was already packed by the time Kaelin and Ilyana reached the doors. Border envoys. Ash priests. Wardens. Half the nobility, that had watched the tribute ceremony fall apart an hour ago, now crammed shoulder to shoulder trying to decide which version of tonight's events they wanted to believe, because a room full of frightened people will always try to agree on a story, before it agrees on the truth, since a story is so much easier to hold onto in the dark. Vorin stood at the head of the room. Of course he did. He'd had time to change. Fresh robes, unmarked by ash, his face arranged into something calm and grave and entirely convincing, and Ilyana understood in that instant exactly what kind of enemy she was dealing with. Not a monster. A performance. Ah, Vorin said, as the doors opened. The king. And his bride. Alive, I see. How fortunate. Careful, Kaelin said. I'm always careful, Your Majesty. It's the only reason this kingdom is still standing. The room murmured. Ilyana felt every eye in it land on her at once, and she made herself stand still under the weight of it, because flinching now would be exactly the kind of evidence Vorin wanted, the small, human tell that would let him rebuild everything he'd just lost in the aviary. Let's begin with the truth, Vorin said, turning to the assembled court. An hour ago, the royal dragon broke his bond. Attacked the tribute ceremony. Named a border-born girl, with no lineage, no lands, no proof of anything, as Queen of Emberfall. And the king, he gestured at Kaelin, almost gently, chose to believe a beast, over 15 years of counsel. You chained him, Kaelin said. I protected the throne. You poisoned the bond. I preserved it. Vorin's voice didn't rise. That was the terrifying part. He never needed to raise his voice, because he'd built a room full of people, who would lean in to hear him instead, who had learned, over 15 years, that Vorin's quiet voice meant something worth hearing, while Kaelin's raised voice meant something to be managed. Ask yourselves. What kind of king inherits a dragon at 10 years old, and somehow keeps that dragon alive, keeps this kingdom fed, keeps the border wolves at bay for 15 years? Not sentiment, my lords. Structure. Every leash in this palace exists, because someone was willing to hold it. Ilyana stepped forward before she could stop herself. And what did holding it cost him, she said. Because I felt it. His pain. Every time that chain tightened around Thren, it tightened around him too. You didn't protect a kingdom. You built a machine that ran on a boy's suffering, and you called the design loyalty. The room went very quiet. Vorin's calm cracked. Just slightly. Just at the corner of his mouth. You know nothing of what this kingdom survived, he said, and for the first time, his voice actually changed. Dropped something. Let something through that had been locked up a long time, something older than tonight, older than the tribute ceremony, older even than Kaelin's crown. Then tell us, Kaelin said. Tell them. Tell me. Why? Vorin looked at him for a long moment. And then, because the truth had been waiting 15 years for a door to walk through, he told them. Your father, Vorin said, was my brother. Which you know. What you don't know is what killed him. The border wolves, Kaelin said. The winter campaign. I know the story. You know the story I gave you, Vorin said. Because the truth was harder to hand a grieving 10-year-old. The room leaned in. Even the priests. Your father believed in free bonds, Vorin said. Believed a dragon should choose its rider the way a friend chooses a friend. No chains. No command runes. Just trust, offered freely, given freely in return. Beautiful idea. I believed it too, once. What happened? Ilyana said. Quiet. Not a demand. An invitation. Vorin's eyes moved to her, and for one unguarded second, she saw the boy he must have been. Younger brother. Believer. Before whatever came next hollowed something out of him, and never gave it back. His dragon loved him, Vorin said. Truly. Freely. And when the border wolves broke, through at Ashwake Pass, that dragon flew, into a storm no sane creature should have flown into, because your father asked him to, and love doesn't calculate odds the way structure does. Silence. They both died, Vorin said. Because a bond built on trust trusted the wrong moment. And I stood over what was left of my brother in the snow, and I made myself a promise. That I would never again let this kingdom's survival depend on a feeling that could simply choose wrong. Kaelin's face had gone pale. You never told me. You were 10, Vorin said. What would telling you have built? A child who feared his own dragon? I built the chain instead. Quietly. Slowly. Told myself it was mercy, dressed as structure, and somewhere along the way, he stopped. Something moved behind his eyes that looked almost like grief. Somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between protecting you and owning you. Ilyana felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But understanding, which was a different animal entirely, and a more dangerous one, because understanding a man's fear made it so much harder to simply hate him clean, the way she'd wanted to hate him, since the first moment his voice ordered a treaty written for a life he'd never had to live. That doesn't excuse the chain, she said. No, Voron said. It doesn't. It doesn't excuse tonight. The ceremony. Sending me to die. No, Voron said again, and this time something in his voice actually broke. It doesn't excuse any of it. But it explains why I will not stop. Because I have already buried one brother to a bond that trusted too freely, and I will not bury a nephew to the same mistake, no matter how much he believes it's love. That's not love, Kaelin said. What you built. That was never love. No, Voron said. It was survival. Which is a colder thing. And colder things last longer. The room didn't know what to do with any of this. Ilyana could feel it, the confusion moving through the crowd like weather, because Voron had just handed them a villain, with a wound instead of a villain, with a mask, and that was so much harder to burn, so much harder to point it cleanly, and say there, that one, he's the danger. Which was, she realized, exactly what he wanted. Because sympathy bought him time. And time was the only weapon he had left that Thren couldn't melt. You still tried to kill me, Ilyana said. Flat. Simple. Refusing to let the room drift too far into forgiveness before the ledger had been fully read. Whatever happened to your brother? Whatever grief built the chain? You still stood in that hall tonight and let me walk toward a ceremony designed to end in my death. Voron didn't deny it. Yes, he said. Why? Because the prophecy the old priests buried, he said the white flame bride would return when the royal bond began to die. I searched every border house. Every forgotten line. Every girl called cursed by frightened villagers who needed somewhere to put their fear. House Voss was hiding exactly what I was looking for. Ilyana's stomach dropped straight through the floor. You knew, she said. About me. Before the treaty was even signed. Of course I knew. My family thought calling me cursed would keep me alive, she said, half to herself, half to the room, the pieces finally clicking into a shape she didn't want to see. Which meant it made you easier to find, Voron said. Yes. The words landed like a slap. Because everything Ilyana had believed about her own life for 22 years, the isolation, the collar, the whispered word cursed following her down every street in Greywatch, none of it had ever been random. None of it had ever been superstition finding an easy target. It had been a hunt. Slow. Patient. Reaching back a year, before the treaty had ever been signed, folded into the arithmetic Voron used to explain everything he'd ever done. And her family had been standing right in the middle of it the entire time, either knowing or refusing to know, which, Ilyana thought bitterly, amounted to the same betrayal wearing two different coats. Which was when the doors at the back of the hall opened. And Sable walked in. Ilyana hadn't expected to see her again. Not here. Not now. Sable had been the border envoy who'd escorted the tribute carriage north, a quiet woman, with tired eyes who'd said almost nothing during the entire journey except the necessary logistics of when to stop and when to keep moving. Now she looked like a woman who hadn't slept in 3 days. My lord, Sable said, and her voice shook on the title in a way that made every head in the room turn. Forgive the interruption. But I can't. I can't stand here and let this go further without saying what I know. Voron's expression flickered. Just barely. Envoy Sable. This isn't the moment. It's the only moment I have left, Sable said, and something in her voice cracked wide open. Because I've carried this since the treaty was signed, and I watched that girl walk into a wedding dress built to be her shroud, and I told myself it wasn't my place to speak. That the debt mattered more than the truth. That House Voss had already decided, and who was I to argue with a family's right to survive? Sable, Ilyana said, quiet. What are you talking about? Sable turned to her, and there were tears in her eyes now, unguarded, ugly, real. Your family knew, she said. Not everything. Not the prophecy, not the bloodline, not what you truly were. But they knew the curse was a story. They knew it long before the treaty. Your father knew it the day he signed it. The room had gone dead silent. Then why? Ilyana said. Her voice barely made it out of her chest. Because Lord Voren came to Greywatch a year before the tribute, Sable said. Privately. Told your father that if House Voss refused to hand you over, the border debt would be called in full, and the debt would take the whole house down with it. Not just the treasury. The people. The tenant farmers. The children in the village, who had nothing to do with any of this. Your father chose between one daughter and hundreds of strangers, and he made the choice men in power always tell themselves is noble. Ilyana felt the floor tilt beneath her. Because that was almost worse than not knowing. Because a father who genuinely believed the curse was real, who sent his daughter away out of fear and superstition, that man was ignorant. Cruel, maybe. But ignorant. A father who knew the truth and sent her anyway, to save strangers he'd never met, over a daughter he had. That man had simply decided her life was worth less. On paper. In arithmetic. The same cold calculation Voren had just confessed to building his entire philosophy around, as though the whole kingdom ran on the same terrible math, and nobody had ever thought to check whether the numbers were actually true. He didn't even say goodbye, Ilyana said. Almost to herself. The morning the carriage came. He didn't come to the door. I know, Sable said. I was there. Why are you telling me this now? Sable's jaw tightened. Because I was told, if I ever spoke, my own family would answer for it. The same way yours did. And I have spent every mile of that road north telling myself silence was survival. She looked at Kaelin. At Voren. At the whole room holding its breath around her. But I watched a dragon call a stranger queen tonight, and something about that broke the arithmetic I'd been living inside. So. Here I am. Whatever it costs. Voren's face had gone carefully blank, the way a man's face goes blank when he's recalculating faster than his expression can keep up. This changes nothing, he said. A frightened envoy's confession doesn't undo 15 years of. It undoes the story you were telling 30 seconds ago, Kaelin said. Cold. Final. The one where you're a grieving man forced into hard choices by circumstance. Because circumstance didn't threaten a village into silence, Voren. You did. The room shifted. Ilyana felt it. The sympathy that had briefly softened around Voren's confession curdled fast into something else. Suspicion. Which was, Ilyana understood, exactly the moment a cornered man stopped explaining himself and started acting. Voren's hand moved to his sleeve. Ilyana caught it. The small motion. The way his fingers found something hidden in the fabric, quick, practiced, a gesture built from years of always having an exit planned. Kaelin, she said. Too late. Voren threw something to the floor. Not a weapon. A vial, small and dark, and it shattered against the stone and released a plume of gray smoke that rolled outward fast, faster than smoke should move, curling toward every corner of the hall like something with intention. The braziers along the wall guttered. Not out. Down. Their fire shrinking to sullen embers, the light in the room dropping, until faces became shapes, and shapes became shadows. A kingdom that lets a dragon speak, Vorin said, his voice suddenly coming from everywhere and nowhere in the gathering dark, deserves to remember what it buried to survive this long. The floor beneath the hall groaned. Not the walls. The floor. Deep, structural, a sound that traveled up, through stone that had been quiet for longer than anyone standing in that room had been alive. What is that? Someone whispered. Ilyana already knew. Because she'd felt something like it once already tonight, in the aviary, in the pull behind her ribs, that had led her straight to Thren, before she understood what it meant. This was the same feeling. Colder. Older. Wrong in a way that made her stomach clench, before her mind caught up to the reason why. Get everyone out, Kaelin said, already moving toward the doors, already pulling nobles by the arm toward the exit, as the gray smoke thickened. Now. Move. The floor split. Not violently. Almost gently, a long clean crack running the length of the hall, and cold air rushed up out of the dark below, carrying a smell Ilyana would spend the rest of her life trying not to remember. Old blood. Old smoke. Something that had been burning, slowly, for centuries, sealed away where no one would ever have to smell it. And from that crack came the sound of wings. Wrong wings. Ilyana had heard Thren's wings tonight, the heavy powerful sweep of something alive and enormous. This was different. Hollow. Leather stretched too tight, over bone, chains scraping against stone, a sound like something remembering how to move, after being told, for a very long time, that it wasn't allowed to. The first shape climbed out of the dark. A dragon. Smaller than Thren, but the wrongness of it made the size feel meaningless. Pale bone showed through torn scales. Silver chains fused straight into the joints of its neck, and wings, each link carved, with old symbols that seemed to drink the little light left in the room. No fire burned in its throat. Instead, a cold gray light flickered between its ribs, obedient, empty, wrong. Its eyes found Vorin. And it knelt. The hall didn't scream. It went past screaming, straight into the kind of silence that only happens when a room realizes, all at once, that everything it believed about the limits of its own world just turned out to be smaller than the truth. Kneel, Vorin said, and his voice had changed. Something colder in it now. Something that had clearly been waiting 15 years for a room desperate enough to need it. The dead dragon obeyed. Kaelin went white. What is that? Insurance, Vorin said. The kind your father never had the stomach to build. Dead dragon bodies, preserved beneath the palace, since before either of us was born, bound so their obedience could be called on, if the living ones ever rebelled. He gestured at the crack in the floor, as a second shape began climbing out. Then a third. You call this rule? I call it insurance. And tonight, nephew, I think you're finally going to understand why insurance exists. Thren arrived at the doorway behind them, drawn by the noise, and Ilyana felt the moment his golden eye found the dead dragons. Felt the fear roll off him. Real fear, the first she'd sensed, from him all night, worse than the pain of the chain, worse than the sickness eating through his scales. Because these weren't strangers to him. She understood that a half-second, before he told her, the knowledge arriving, through the mark on her chest like a struck bell. They were his. Images tore through her mind, sharp and sudden, Thren's memories pouring into her faster than she could brace for them. A younger black dragon flying in formation, with others, wings cutting through storm light. A silver-scaled female, with laughing gold eyes, diving beside him through clouds. A small red hatchling, clumsy, tumbling, learning to fly, with a whole sky of family watching. Then war. Then betrayal. Then chains, and darkness, and death that had never been allowed to finish being death. He's dead, Ilyana said, her voice barely a whisper. Kaelin looked at her. What? They were his, she said, staring at the second dead dragon now fully emerged, from the crack in the floor, silver scales, bone showing through in patches. His family. His flight. He's flown above the palace for years, and never known his own kind were sleeping right underneath him. Chained. Awake enough to hurt. Never awake enough to be free. Something in Kaelin's face broke. Because if Voren had done this, if this was what protecting the throne actually looked like beneath the polished language, then the man who'd raised him hadn't just poisoned a bond. He'd built an entire architecture of suffering, and called it structure. Called it survival. Called it love, wearing a very strict, very cold, very patient face. Voren, Kaelin said, and his voice had gone somewhere Ilyana hadn't heard it go before. Somewhere past anger. Somewhere closer to grief, that had finally found its target. How long? Longer than you've been alive, Voren said. The Ash priests built this centuries ago. I only maintained it. Improved it. Made it useful again after decades of neglect. You improved a graveyard. I improved a weapon, Voren said. Which is what a kingdom needs, whether it wants to admit it or not. The dead dragons kept climbing. 3. Then 4. Their silver chains dragging, their empty eyes fixed on Voren, with a devotion that had nothing behind it, no warmth, no memory, no self left to give the devotion meaning. Just obedience. Endless. Mechanical. Complete. This is your strength, Voren said, turning to the court, his voice rising now to fill the hall, to reach every noble pressed against the walls trying not to be seen. This is what your soft king would deny you. Dragons that don't question. Dragons that don't choose. Dragons that serve the crown even beyond death. You call this rule, Kaelin said. I call it a corpse wearing a crown. Voren's jaw tightened. Careful, nephew. You're standing very close to finding out what the corpse can do. Ilyana felt Thren's fear sharpen into something closer to fury, a low building heat that pressed against the mark on her chest like a hand asking permission. Don't, she said, quiet, to the dragon, to herself, to all of them. Not yet. Because if Thren attacked, the dead dragons would answer, and they had no fear left to lose, no self left to protect, and a fight here would burn, through this hall, through this court, through every noble too slow, or too shocked to run. Which meant Voren had built the perfect trap. If Kaelin moved against him, the dead would burn the court. If Ilyana used her fire, Voren would call her the true danger, proof of exactly the chaos he'd spent 15 years warning everyone about. Every path led somewhere that made her look guilty. She'd seen this shape before. In smaller rooms. Smaller cruelties. Men who built situations where a woman's only choices were silence or blame, and called the design fairness because, technically, she'd been given a choice. She was done accepting that kind of choice is real. There is your queen, Emberfall, Voren called out, pointing at her, his voice carrying to every corner of the smoke-thick hall. Ask yourselves what her mercy brings you. Living dragons turning from their riders. Dead dragons waking from their rightful rest. A white flame bright inside the heart of your throne. If she isn't stopped tonight, every law this kingdom has ever built on flame becomes sentiment. Becomes weather. Becomes nothing you can rely on. A border envoy near the wall found his voice. Shaking, but present. And if she's stopped? What then? We bow to corpses? You bow to order, Voren said. No, Kaelin said, sword already rising. They bow to fear wearing a crown. The dead dragons spread their wings. Not attacking. Not yet. Just present, just enough, a threat that didn't need to move to be understood. Thren lowered his head beside Ilyana, and his voice entered her the way it had in the aviary. Not through sound. Through bone. They were mine. I know, she whispered. Give them back their names. Ilyana's breath caught. What? The chains hold the shape, not the soul. Names were taken first, before the chains could hold. Kaelin had heard it too, or felt enough of it, through whatever thin thread still connected him to the dragon even after the bond had been reforged. What did he show you? His dead, Ilyana said. And how to answer them. Vorin lifted both arms, and Ilyana understood, with cold clarity, that he was one word away from ending this the only way he knew how. Choose, nephew, he said. Let the cursed bride command the living, or let me prove the old crown still has teeth. The dead dragon's jaws began to glow, faint gray fire gathering low in their throats, cold and obedient, and utterly without mercy, because mercy required a self, and there was no self left inside them to draw it from. The court screamed. Actually screamed now, silk and jewels scattering toward exits that Kaelin's guards were still trying to clear. Kaelin moved toward Vorin, sword raised, and Ilyana caught his wrist. No, she said. They'll burn the hall before you reach him. Then what? Time, she said. Give me time. He looked at her. Really looked, the way a man looks at someone he's about to trust, with something he can't take back. Then he turned toward the dead dragons instead of his uncle, sword blazing suddenly, with living dragonfire, and shouted to Thren. Give her time. Thren roared and launched himself at the nearest dead dragon. The two collided in a storm of black fire and gray flame, the hall shaking with the force of it, and Kaelin followed, sword cutting into the chaos, not to command the beast beside him, but to fight alongside him, shoulder to shoulder, king and dragon finally moving as one thing instead of a leash, and what it held. Ilyana walked into the center of the hall. Vorin saw her coming. Stop her. One of the dead dragons turned, jaws already glowing gray. Ilyana raised both hands. Not to strike. To call. White fire rose around her, soft at first, then brighter, spilling across the ash-streaked floor, and touching the dead dragon's clawed feet. She let it move up through old bone. Through fused chain. Through cold runes carved by men, who had feared a dragon's choice more than they had ever feared a dragon's death. Nothing. At first. Then, beneath centuries of command, buried so deep it had almost stopped being real, she found a thread. A sound. A name worn thin by time, but not erased. Anara. She spoke it aloud. The dead dragon's head jerked, hard, like something waking, from the inside. Vorin's face went pale. Do not. Ilyana didn't stop. Because a name wasn't only a word. A name was a door, and doors, once found, didn't close just because someone powerful said they should. Vesik, she called toward the second. Aerith, toward the third, her voice rising, filling the hall the way Thren's voice had filled it earlier, that night, not through volume, but through something older than volume. The silver dragon stopped mid-strike, hollow eyes flashing gold for one impossible second. Thren roared. Not in battle now. In grief so old it had waited generations to finally be allowed out. Kaelin lowered his sword, understanding breaking across his face like dawn arriving too fast for a man who'd spent all night in the dark. Their names were erased, Ilyana said, half to him, half to the whole trembling court. That's how the chains hold. Not through the body. Through forgetting. A dragon that no longer remembers its own name has nothing left to argue with the leash. Vorin's voice cracked, high and furious. Stop this. Now. She didn't. Anara, she said again. Vesik. Aerith. Corwin. Melis. Each name struck the hall like a bell. Each one, a dead dragon shuddering, gray fire flickering, then thinning, then turning, slowly, painfully, to gold. To white. To something soft as falling ash. Their chains cracked. Then broke. The court, still pressed against the walls, watched in stunned silence, as the army Vorin had raised began, one by one, to kneel. Not in obedience. In release. No, Vorin said, and for the first time all night, Ilyana heard real fear in his voice. I preserved them. You used them, she said. Thren stepped beside her, wounded but towering, and Kaelin came to her other side, breathing hard, a thin line of blood at his mouth, sword lowered. Together, the three of them faced Vorin across a hall full of dragons, finally being allowed to finish dying the way they should have been allowed to years ago. The last chain, around the silver dragon Aerith, shattered. Her bones dissolved into white sparks, rising slowly toward the smoke-dark ceiling. Then the others followed, not destroyed, but freed, their light circling once, through the hall like something saying goodbye, before pouring straight into Thren. His wounds glowed. His broken wing lifted, higher than it had all night. His eyes, for the first time, since Ilyana had seen him, burned clear. The court, one by one, sank to their knees. Not commanded. Not afraid, not exactly. Something closer to reverence, the kind that arrives uninvited, when a person finally witnesses something true, after a lifetime of being fed careful lies. Vorin stood alone at the head of the hall, surrounded by ash, where his army had been. You think this changes anything, he said, but his voice had lost its architecture. It sounded, for the first time, like an old man's voice. Tired. Cornered. You think a room full of frightened nobles kneeling to a fire trick means the throne is safe now? No, Kaelin said. I think it means the throne finally has to earn what it used to just take. Vorin's eyes moved to Ilyana. And for a moment, something almost like respect crossed his face, buried under everything else, under fear and grief, and 15 years of a philosophy built on the worst night of his life. You freed my brother's mistake, he said quietly. And called it mercy. No, Ilyana said. I freed your mistake. And called it what it was. He didn't run this time either. He simply stood there, in the wreckage of the plan he'd spent 15 years constructing, and watched it come apart in front of a court that had, an hour ago, been ready to watch him win. Which was, Ilyana understood, its own kind of ending. Not the loud kind. Not the kind, with swords and blood and final speeches. The quiet kind, where a man simply runs out of room to keep telling the story he needed everyone else to believe. Kaelin stepped toward him. Lord Vorin Ashran. By witness of this court, of dragon, of every soul standing in this hall tonight, you are relieved of your regency. Effective now. Vorin's jaw tightened. And what happens to me? That, Kaelin said, will be decided by law. Not by fear. Which is more than you ever offered anyone standing in this room. Guards moved forward, hesitant at first, then steadier when Vorin didn't resist, didn't reach for his sleeve again, didn't do anything, but stand very still, and let them take his arms. As they led him toward the doors, he looked back once. Not at Kaelin. At Ilyana. He will need you, he said, until the court fears you too much. Then he will call you dangerous. The way all kings eventually do. The words were poison, precisely because they were possible. Ilyana felt them land somewhere she'd have to deal with later, in a quieter room, without an audience watching to see if they'd hit. But not tonight. If he does, she said, steady, I won't need you to warn me. Vorin had no answer for that. The guards took him, through the doors, past nobles who stepped back from his path, as though betrayal could stain a robe, through proximity alone, and when he disappeared, into the corridor beyond, the hall exhaled all at once, a held breath finally released. Thren lowered his head, and the sound that came out of him this time wasn't grief. It was something closer to peace. Fragile. New. The first breath of a creature who had just watched his family finally allowed to rest. Kaelin turned to Ilyana. His face was streaked with ash, blood still at his mouth, his hand trembling faintly where it hung at his side, but his eyes, when they found hers, had none of the suspicion they'd carried in the throne room. You didn't have to do that, he said. The names. You didn't know if it would work. No, she said. I didn't. Then why risk it? Ilyana looked at Thren. At the court still kneeling, slowly rising now, uncertain what to do, with a truth this large. At the crack in the floor, quiet now, the dark below finally empty of everything it had been forced to hold. Because somebody had to bet on the version, where names still mattered, she said. Even after everyone spent this long trying to erase them. Kaelin studied her for a long moment. My father would have liked you, he said finally. And that terrifies me more than anything Vorin just showed us. Why? Because he trusted freely, Kaelin said, and it killed him. Ilyana held his gaze. Then don't trust me freely. Trust me carefully. There's a difference, and I think tonight proved which one actually survives. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. Something steadier than that. Thren's golden eye watched them both, and somewhere deep in his chest, the low rumble that came out of him this time sounded, unmistakably, like approval. The hall was quiet now. Ash settling. Nobles rising unsteadily, from the floor, whispering to each other in tones that had already started, cautiously, to change shape, from fear into something closer to disbelief, and from disbelief, Ilyana knew, into whatever came next. Because tonight had broken something in Emberfall, that 15 years of careful architecture had built to never break. And somewhere below the palace, in the corridor leading toward the east tower, where Vorin now sat under guard, the old ash priests, who had built this whole design in the first place, were only just beginning to understand that their carefully buried secret hadn't stayed buried after all. That was a problem for tomorrow. Tonight, Ilyana Voss stood in a hall full of kneeling nobles, a freed dragon at her side, and a king, whose hand had found hers, without either of them quite deciding to let it happen, and for the first time, since the carriage had left Greywatch 3 days ago, she let herself breathe. All the way down. Without bracing for what came next. It didn't last long. Because far below them, in the dark beneath the east tower, something the priests had hidden even from Vorin was about to wake up on its own, and the story that had ended, for one fragile hour, in that lower hall, was only the first ending Emberfall would have to survive tonight. Something woke beneath the east tower. Ilyana felt it before anyone said a word. A pull, low and cold, dragging at the same place in her ribs that had led her to Thren hours ago. Except this pull didn't feel like recognition. It felt like dread. Something's wrong, she said. Kaelin was already turning toward the sound. Because a groan had started moving through the stone beneath their feet, slow, patient, the kind of sound a building makes when it's been holding its breath for centuries and has finally decided to let it out. That's not the aviary, he said. That's under the east tower. Where they took Vorin. Yes. Which meant whatever was waking up down there had nothing to do with Vorin's chains. His army was gone. Freed. Ash rising through a broken ceiling toward a sky that hadn't seen them in generations, scattered light where a graveyard used to be. So this was something else. Something older. Something that had survived even the collapse of everything Vorin had built, because it had never actually belonged to him in the first place. Thren's head snapped toward the tower, and the sound that came out of him wasn't a roar. It was smaller than that. Tighter. A sound Ilyana hadn't heard from him yet, not even in the worst of the chain, not even in the grief of his family's names. Fear. Thren, Ilyana said. What is it? The answer came the way his answers always came. Not words. Wait. Pressure behind her eyes, images pouring in too fast to brace for. Robed men, gathered in a circle beneath torchlight. Not Vorin's men. Older robes, gray instead of black, the sigil of the ash priests stitched into every collar. A stone door, sealed with runes, that made even Thren's memory recoil from looking at them directly. And beneath that door, something the priests had built long before any Ashran sat on the throne. Something even Voron, for all his careful architecture, had never been trusted to know about. Ilyana staggered. They kept something from him, she said. From Voron. Something bigger than the chains. Kaelin's face had gone very still. The priests answer to no king. They never have. They call it tradition. I call it a second throne, Ilyana said. Hidden under the first one. They ran. Kaelin first, sword still in hand, Ilyana close behind, Thren forced to circle above the palace roofline, because his body was too large for the corridors, his voice threading, through her mind the whole way down, low and urgent. Hurry. The stairwell to the east tower spiraled down instead of up, deeper than Ilyana expected, deeper than any tower had any business going, and the air changed, as they descended. Colder. Thinner. Carrying that same old smell, from the crack in the lower hall's floor, blood and smoke, and centuries of something sealed away from daylight. They found the guards first. Unconscious. All three of them, slumped against the wall outside a door Ilyana recognized, without ever having seen it, because Thren's memory had already shown it to her. Gray stone. Old runes. A seal that had clearly just been broken, from the inside. Voron, Kaelin said. He's not chained down here, Ilyana said. He's supposed to be in a cell. Under guard. He was. The door stood open now. Beyond it, torchlight flickered against wet stone, and somewhere further in, voices. Low. Chanting. The particular rhythm of men, who had said the same words, so many times the meaning had worn smooth, like a stone handled for generations. Kaelin stepped through first. The chamber beyond the door was older than the palace above it. Older, Ilyana suspected, than the palace's founding stone. Gray-robed priests stood in a circle around a second seal, smaller than the tower door, but denser somehow, layered with runework in a script even older than the one carved into Thren's stolen horns. And at the center of that circle, on his knees, wrists still bound, from his arrest, knelt Voron. Not a prisoner. A key. Let him go, Kaelin said, sword rising. The oldest priest turned. White-bearded, stooped, his eyes clouded, with age but sharp underneath it, sharp in a way that made Ilyana's skin crawl. Your Majesty, the priest said, and his voice carried none of the fear the rest of the court had shown. You're too late. And also. Exactly on time. Explain that, Kaelin said. Now. The priest gestured, almost gently, toward Voron. Your uncle believed he built the chains that held the dragon bond. He believed he built the army beneath the lower hall. He was correct. About both. What he never knew, the priest's gaze slid to Voron, something almost like pity in it, was who taught him how. Voron's head came up. Slow. His face, for the first time all night, looked genuinely lost. You, he said. You came to me. 15 years ago. After Ashwake Pass. You said you had knowledge that could save the kingdom from another bond gone wrong. I did, the priest said. And it did save the kingdom. For 15 years. Which was always the point. What point? Kaelin said. The priest smiled, and it was the worst thing Ilyana had seen all night, worse than the dead dragons, worse than the chains, because it was the smile of a man who believed, completely, that everything he had done was righteous. 300 years ago, he said, a queen of the white flame stood, where your bride stands now. And she believed, the way idealists always believe, that dragons should choose freely. That kings should rule by consent instead of command. She very nearly succeeded. What stopped her? Ilyana said. We did, the priest said, simple as weather. Because a kingdom built on consent is a kingdom that can be refused. And a kingdom that can be refused is a kingdom that eventually falls, the moment enough dragons decide their king isn't worth the trust he's asking for. We could not allow that fragility. So we buried her line. Quietly. Over generations. Every girl born with the mark found and ended before the mark could wake. Ilyana felt something cold move through her chest. My mother, she said. Fled us, the priest said. Successfully, for 22 years. We suspected House Voss for some time. It was Lord Voron's search and envoy Sable's road north that confirmed it for us over the past year, piece by piece, until tonight left no doubt at all. He inclined his head, almost courteous. We owe him a debt for that. Even if he never knew he was working for us. Voron's face had gone the color of old ash. You used me. We used the chain you already wanted to build, the priest said. We simply made sure it pointed toward the right target, eventually. Kaelin's sword hadn't lowered. If anything, it had gone steadier, the way a blade goes steady in the hand of a man, who has finally found the thing worth being still for. You're telling me, he said, that everything my uncle did. The chains. The dead dragons. 15 years of pain dressed up as protection. All of it was built on knowledge you handed him. Knowledge, the priest agreed, that we have handed to every regent, every nervous advisor, every frightened second son standing too close to a throne for 3 centuries. It is remarkably easy to control a kingdom, Your Majesty, when you simply teach the people closest to power that fear is wisdom. They do the rest of the work themselves. Ilyana looked past him, to the second seal at the center of the chamber. What's behind that door? The priest's expression shifted, just slightly. The first genuine emotion Ilyana had seen on him. Reverence. The first bond, he said. The original. Before any Ashran crown existed. The pact the first White Flame Queen made, with the first free dragon, sealed away because a bond that pure, if ever remembered, would remind every dragon in this kingdom exactly what they gave up, when they accepted a chain instead. You're afraid of a memory, Kaelin said. We are afraid, the priest said, of the truth. Which is the only thing a structure like ours has ever truly needed to fear. He turned to Voron, still kneeling, still bound. Which is why, the priest said, we need his blood. One final time. Ashran blood was used to seal that door 3 centuries ago. Ashran blood is required to open it again, and we intend to make certain it stays open long enough to burn what's behind it, before your bride's fire can reach it first. Voron's eyes lifted to Kaelin's. Don't, he said. Rough. Urgent. The first time all night his voice had sounded like something other than architecture. Whatever this is. Whatever they need me for. Don't let them have it. I wasn't planning to, Kaelin said. The priests moved as one. Which? Of course they did. Because men who have practiced the same ritual for 3 centuries don't need to discuss the choreography, and Ilyana barely had time to register the first blade rising toward Voron's bound wrists, before Kaelin was already moving. Sword first. Fire following. The chamber exploded, into motion, robed figures scattering, chanting breaking into shouts, and Ilyana felt Thren's fury roll down, through the bond like a wave breaking against rock, because he was still circling somewhere above the tower, too large to reach them, forced to watch, through her eyes, while his king fought alone in a chamber built to survive exactly this kind of interruption. Not alone, Ilyana thought. She stepped into the fray. White fire rose from her palms, not aimed at the priests, she wasn't ready for that, wasn't sure she ever would be, but at the chains still holding Voron's wrists. The metal glowed, softened, gave. Voron's hands came free. Move, Ilyana said. He didn't argue. 15 years of careful control apparently didn't extend to arguing, with a woman on fire in the middle of a collapsing ritual chamber, and Voron scrambled clear of the circle just as the oldest priest turned on Ilyana instead, his staff crackling with something dark and old. You, he said. The last mark. The one thing we failed to bury. I'm right here, Ilyana said. Try again. The staff came down. She caught the blow on a wall of white fire that flared up between them, and the impact sent her staggering, but she held. Barely. The mark on her chest burned hot enough to hurt, a warning, a limit she hadn't found yet, and somewhere behind her she heard Kaelin's sword ringing against a second priest's blade, heard Voron's voice, unarmed, shouting something that might have been a warning, or might have been an apology. She couldn't tell which anymore, and didn't have time to find out. "You cannot win this," the old priest said, pressing forward, his staff crackling harder now. "You are one girl against 3 centuries of preparation." "I'm not one girl," Ilyana said. "I'm the last name you couldn't erase. And I brought a dragon." The ceiling above them cracked. Not from a spell. From claws. Thren had apparently decided he was done circling. Stone rained down as the dragon tore through the tower roof, too large for the chamber, forcing his head and one clawed foreleg through the widening gap, and the priests scattered from beneath him the way anything scatters from something that sighs, deciding it has had enough patience for one night. "He can't fit through," the old priest said, backing away. "He's bluffing." Thren didn't need to fit through. He breathed. White gold fire poured down through the broken ceiling, not aimed at the priests directly. Ilyana felt him hold back, some careful instinct even in his fury, but at the chamber itself, at the ancient rune work lining every wall, and the symbols that had held 3 centuries of secrets in place began, one by one, to blacken and crack. The old priest's face went from fury to something closer to horror. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said. "That door has held for 300 years. If it opens uncontrolled, then let it open," Kaelin said, standing over the second priest, disarmed now, sword resting at his throat, but not moving to finish it. "Let all of it open. I'm done with kingdoms that survive by keeping their people in the dark about what's holding them up." The second seal, the smaller one, the one guarding whatever lay behind the original bond, began to glow. Not from an attack. From Voron. Ilyana turned. He'd crossed to the seal himself, free hands pressed flat against the ancient stone, blood still welling faintly from where the priest's blade had nicked him during the struggle. "Voron," Kaelin said. "What are you doing?" "Finishing something," Voron said, "that I apparently started 15 years ago, without ever understanding the shape of it." "Your blood opens it either way," the priest said, desperate now. "You cannot stop what you already." "I know," Voron said. "So I'd rather open it myself. On my terms. Than let you use me as a key one more time in my life." The seal cracked down the center. Light poured out. Not fire, not quite. Something gentler, older, a soft gold-white glow that filled the chamber and washed the horror off every stone wall like water finally reaching somewhere long parched. And in the light, for just a moment, Ilyana saw them. The first white flame queen. Standing beside a dragon made of dawn, her hand raised, not in command, but in offering. And a king beside her, young, unafraid, his own hand rising to meet hers, and between them a bond that asked nothing and demanded nothing, that existed simply because both of them had chosen it, freely, every single day, for as long as they'd been given. The vision lasted only a heartbeat. Then it was gone, and the chamber stood empty of everything except broken stone, guttering torches, and the wreckage of 3 centuries of careful, patient cruelty. The old priest sank to his knees. Not defeated by force. Undone by something simpler. By finally seeing, with his own eyes, the exact thing he had spent his whole life making sure no one else ever got to see. "It was beautiful," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "That's why we buried it. Because if the whole kingdom saw what it actually looked like, nobody would have settled for what we built instead." The other priests didn't fight anymore. Some fled. Most simply stood, robes torn, staffs abandoned on the stone floor, watching the last of the golden light fade from the broken seal like men watching the only thing they'd ever truly believed in disappear in real time. Kaelin lowered his sword. Looked at Vorin, still kneeling by the shattered stone, blood on his hands, on his robes, on a face that had aged a decade in the last hour alone. You could have let it stay sealed, Kaelin said. Let them use your blood. Blamed the priests for everything. Walked away from this with your excuses intact. I know, Vorin said. Why didn't you? Vorin looked up. And for the first time, since Ilyana had met him, screaming orders in the throne room, smiling through lies in the lower hall, she saw a man, with nothing left to perform. Because I spent 15 years telling myself fear was structure, he said. And tonight I watched a girl I tried to kill save my life instead. There's no chain strong enough to argue, with that kind of evidence, nephew. Even I know when I've been proven wrong. They brought him up, from the tower in chains. His own request. Kaelin had offered to release him on the walk back, at least until formal judgment could be passed, and Vorin had refused, quiet and firm, the first order he'd given all night, that wasn't really an order at all. Let the court see it done properly, he'd said. Let them see that even a man, who nearly burned the kingdom down, answers to the same law he tried to bend for 15 years. That matters more than my comfort. So they walked him, through the palace in irons, past nobles who had knelt to a dragon 2 hours earlier, and now watched the architect of half their fear pass by in silence, and Ilyana understood, walking beside Kaelin, through that quiet corridor, that this was its own kind of ending. Not the loud kind. The kind that mattered more, because it would still be true tomorrow, and the day after, long after the fire had gone out of tonight's story, and left only the structure standing behind it. The battle in the tower had settled the danger. What came next would settle the shape of the kingdom that survived it, and that, Ilyana was beginning to understand, was a different kind of fight altogether, one fought with law instead of fire. The dawn came gray and slow over Emberfall, the kind of light that arrives after a night nobody in the palace would ever be able to fully explain to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Ilyana didn't sleep. Neither did Kaelin. They sat together in a small chamber off the Hall of Wings, while healers wrapped the worst of his wounds, and while neither of them spoke, because some nights don't leave room for words right away, they just need to be sat inside, quietly, until the body remembers how to be a body again instead of a battlefield. The formal trial happened 3 days later. 3 days that Ilyana would spend, later, trying to describe to people who hadn't been there, and always failing, because there was no simple way to explain how a kingdom rebuilds its understanding of itself in 72 hours. Border envoys rode out and rode back, with reports of dragons landing in villages that hadn't seen a free bond in 3 centuries. Wardens across Emberfall began, cautiously, testing their own bonds, some for the first time in their lives actually asking their dragons a question instead of giving them an order. Some of those questions did not go the way the wardens hoped. A few dragons flew, that first day, straight off the towers, and did not come back, and nobody stopped them, and that, Kaelin said quietly one evening, watching an empty tower platform, where a bonded dragon had roosted for 11 years, was the price of an honest kingdom. You don't get to keep everyone who was only ever staying because they were chained. It happened in the same Hall of Wings, where Ilyana had once stood barefoot in tribute silk, waiting to die. She stood there again. Not bound this time. Not silent. Witness. Kaelin sat the throne, the black iron seat still cracked down one side, from what had happened 3 nights before, a scar the palace masons had been forbidden to repair. He'd insisted on that. Said a throne that pretended it had never been broken was a throne lying to everyone who looked at it. Vorin stood before the assembled court. Chained. Steady. Lord Vorin, the presiding magistrate said, an old border judge Kaelin had summoned specifically, because she owed her position to no one in the palace. You stand accused of poisoning the royal dragon bond. Of constructing an army from the desecrated dead. Of conspiring to end the life of Ilyana Voss under the guise of lawful tribute. How do you answer? Guilty, Voron said. Simple. No performance left in it. On every count. A murmur moved through the court. Not shock, exactly. Something closer to relief, the particular relief of watching a man finally stop arguing with the truth. You could have contested this, the magistrate said. Claimed the priests manipulated you. Claimed diminished responsibility. I could have, Voron said. It would even have been partly true. But partly true isn't the same as innocent, and I've spent enough of my life letting partly true stand in for the whole shape of things. I won't do it again. Not here. Not with her standing in this room. His eyes moved to Ilyana. Not asking forgiveness. Simply acknowledging her, the way a man acknowledges a debt he knows he'll be paying, in some form, for the rest of his life. The sentence, when it came, surprised the court. Not death. Kaelin had made that clear before the trial even began, quiet but immovable, in a private conversation Ilyana had watched happen in the corridor outside the Hall of Wings the night before. If I kill him, Kaelin had said, I prove every fear he ever had about me. That sentiment breaks a throne. That mercy is weakness dressed as virtue. I want to prove the opposite. That a kingdom can hold a man accountable, without becoming the thing it's punishing him for. And if he does it again, Ilyana had asked. Whatever comes after this. If given power, he reaches for a chain. Then the law reaches back, Kaelin had said. Not me. Not personally. The law. Built so it doesn't depend on which king happens to be sitting the throne when the next crisis comes. So the sentence was exile from the crown, permanent removal from any line of succession, and 10 years of labor rebuilding the border wall at Ashwake Pass, the same pass where his brother had died, where the whole architecture of his fear had first been poured in concrete. You'll spend a decade, the magistrate said, repairing the exact wound that built everything you did wrong. Some might call that cruelty. I call it fitting, Voron said. I've spent 15 years building walls out of other people's fear. Perhaps it's time I built one out of my own hands instead. The guards led him out. Through the same doors Ilyana had once been dragged, through in tribute silk. And this time, when he passed her, he stopped. Just for a moment. For what it's worth, he said, I was wrong about you. Not about the danger. You are dangerous. Every honest person who's ever changed anything was. I was wrong, that danger and cruelty were the same thing. They're not, Ilyana said. No, Voron agreed. I'm only sorry it took me 15 years, and a dragon's fire to learn the difference. He didn't wait for a response. Didn't need one. The guards led him out, into the courtyard, into the daylight, toward whatever the next decade of his life would actually be, instead of the story he'd spent so long telling himself about it. That left the throne. Because a throne cracked down the middle doesn't simply go back to being a throne once the trial ends, and the crowd disperses. It sits there. Waiting. Asking a question nobody in that hall had fully answered yet. The old ash priest, the one who'd survived the tower, the one who'd finally seen what he'd spent his whole life hiding, stood before the court that same afternoon, stripped of his staff, his authority, everything except the truth he could no longer take back. The ash priesthood, he said, voice cracking with age and exhaustion, confesses before this court that for 3 centuries we have hunted the white flame bloodline. That we manufactured fear to preserve a structure that served us more than it ever served this kingdom. We ask no mercy. We ask only that the truth, once spoken, be allowed to stand. Kaelin looked at him a long moment. The priesthood is dissolved, he said. Effective today. Any priest who wishes to remain in Emberfall may do so, as a citizen, under the same law as every other citizen. No more staffs. No more secret chambers beneath the palace. If you have wisdom worth keeping, teach it in the open, where it can be questioned. That's the only kind of wisdom I intend to build a kingdom on, from here forward. The old man bowed his head. And for the first time in 300 years, no institution in Emberfall answered to fear dressed up as tradition. Which left the throne itself. Kaelin stood before it, in front of the assembled court, in front of border envoys, and freed dragons circling the towers outside, and nobles who had watched, over 3 days, an entire kingdom's foundation get rebuilt in front of their eyes. The old law, he said, held that a throne answers to one flame. One bloodline. One ruler, chosen by blood, and defended by force. He looked at the crack running down the black iron, the scar he'd refused to let the masons repair. I don't believe that anymore. I'm not sure I ever really did. I think I just never had proof there was another way to build it. He turned to Ilyana. I have proof now. She felt every eye in the hall land on her. Felt the particular weight of a room deciding, in real time, what story it was about to watch unfold. I'm not asking you to rule beside me, Kaelin said. I watched what a throne did to a man who thought love and ownership were the same thing. I won't build another one that makes the same mistake even with better intentions. Then what are you asking? Ilyana said. Nothing, Kaelin said. That's the point. I'm not asking. I'm telling this court what I know to be true, whether you choose to stay or not. That Thren didn't call you queen because of a bloodline. He called you queen because you were the first person in 3 centuries who looked at a chain and refused to accept it as the natural order of things. That's not a birthright. That's a choice. You make it every single day, or you don't make it at all. Ilyana looked past him, to the cracked throne. To the 2 threads of light still visible in the fracture, pale gold and deep crown fire red, braided together where the iron had split, neither one erasing the other. Rule and witness. Power and consent. I don't want the crown, she said, and the words came out steady, because she'd been carrying them, since the moment the dragon first spoke her name in a hall full of people hoping to watch her die. Nobody in the court gasped this time. They'd learned, over 3 days, to expect the unexpected from her. I spent 22 years being told what I was by people who never once asked me, Ilyana said. Cursed. Useful. Dangerous. Queen. Every name landed on me, from outside, and I'm done letting a title decide who I get to be, before I've had the chance to decide it myself. Then what do you want? Kaelin asked. Not a challenge. A real question. To stand as witness, she said. Not above the throne. Not beneath it. Beside it. Every bond in this kingdom gets tested, from now on, freely offered, freely proven, and I intend to be in the room when it happens. Not because a crown gives me the right. Because I earned it the hard way, and I'm not interested in trading that for a title that would only make people start doubting whether I earned it at all. Kaelin studied her for a long moment. Then he did something no one in that hall had ever seen an Ashran king do. He knelt. Not to her. Not exactly. He knelt before the cracked throne itself, one hand pressed flat against the fractured iron, and spoke loud enough for the whole court to hear. By right of flame and witness, I declare that no dragon bond in Emberfall shall be sealed, severed, or renewed without a witness present, who cannot be bought, chained, or silenced by the crown. I name Ilyana Voss that witness. Not by my gift. By her own proof, offered freely, in front of every soul in this hall. The throne, cracked and scarred, seemed almost to settle at the words, the way old wood settles once a house has finally stopped fighting its own foundation. Ilyana felt the mark over her heart warm. Not burn. Warm, the way a hearth warms a room instead of threatening to take it apart. Outside, through the tall windows of the Hall of Wings, dragons circled the towers of Emberfall in numbers nobody in that court had seen in living memory. Some bonded still to riders, who had chosen, honestly, to keep them. Some flying free, testing wings that had spent years believing freedom wasn't a real option. Thren landed in the courtyard below, folding his wings, his scales no longer cracked and leaking dull fire, but whole now, dark and deep and gleaming, the way obsidian gleams, when it's finally allowed to simply be what it is instead of a wound wearing armor. Ilyana walked out to him. Kaelin followed, a few steps behind, giving her the space he'd learned, over 3 days, that she needed, before she'd ever ask for it herself. The dragon lowered his head. "Queen," he said, into her mind, one more time, gentle now instead of thunderous. "Witness," she corrected. Not sharply. Just honest. Thren's golden eye seemed almost to smile. If a dragon's eye could do such a thing. "Witness, then," he agreed. "Though I suspect the word will mean the same thing, once enough years have passed." Kaelin came to stand beside her, close but not touching, the courtyard bathed in the low gold light of a sun finally setting on the longest 3 days of both their lives. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what?" "For the aviary. That first night. I asked you to prove yourself. Like you owed me evidence for simply existing." Ilyana considered that. "You were a king who'd been taught his whole life that trust needed proof before it could be safe." "I understand that better than you'd think. Doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "But it makes it human. I spent 22 years being punished for things I never did. You spent 15 being taught that love was a liability. Neither of us walked into that aviary as finished people. I'd rather build something with a man still figuring it out than one who's already decided he has nothing left to learn." Kaelin looked at her for a long moment, the last of the sunset catching gold in his eyes, the vein at his throat finally, fully quiet, healed, still visible as a thin pale scar, but no longer a wound. "I won't ask you to stay," he said. "I learned that much, at least. Asking is its own kind of chain, if the person doesn't feel free enough to refuse." "I know," Ilyana said. "So I'll just say the true thing instead. I want you here. Not because a dragon named you queen. Not because a court needs a witness. Because in 3 days you taught me more about what a throne should actually be for than 15 years of careful, patient teaching ever did, and I don't want to find out what kind of king I become, if you're not standing somewhere nearby to keep asking me the harder questions." Ilyana felt something in her chest ease, slow, like a held breath finally allowed all the way out. "I'll stay," she said. "For now. For now is more than I expected to earn." "Good," she said. "Earn the rest of it, then. One day at a time. That's the only kind of trust one know how to give anymore, and honestly, I think it's the only kind worth having." Above them, Thren spread his wings and rose into the darkening sky, joining the others circling the towers of Emberfall, dozens of dragons moving in loose, unchained formation against the last light of the day. Some would leave the kingdom entirely, in the weeks that followed, choosing riders in distant holds, or choosing no rider at all, testing a freedom 3 centuries of fear had told them was too dangerous to want. Most would stay. Because it turned out, once given an honest choice, that most bonds, the true ones, the ones built on something other than chains, had never needed the chains to hold them in the first place. The old law had gotten one thing right, buried under all its fear. A kingdom is only as strong as what it's willing to let choose it freely. Emberfall had spent 3 centuries too afraid to find out what that actually meant. It was finding out now. Ilyana Voss stood in the courtyard of the palace that had once gathered to watch her die, the last light fading gold across black stone, a king beside her, who had learned the hard way the difference between owning something and being trusted with it, and a sky full of dragons, who no longer had to ask permission to fly. She did not wear a crown. She did not need one. She had spent 22 years being told what her life was worth by people who never once asked her, and standing there, in the quiet, after the fire, she understood, finally, completely, that the only name that had ever truly mattered was the one she'd chosen for herself. Witness. Not to a throne. To the truth. Wherever it led, however long it took, however many careful, patient lies still needed burning, before this kingdom finally became the thing it kept insisting, all along, it already was. The dragons circled once more, high above the broken, healing throne, and somewhere in that wide, darkening sky, a girl who had once been called cursed watched them fly free, and understood, for the first time in her life, exactly what her own name was supposed to sound like.